We are here today to listen to conversations about translation, but the first thing that we wanted to do was to thank our very generous sponsors for this event, the Department of English and Creative Writing, the Program in Comparative Literature, the Office of the Associate Dean for Interdisciplinary Programs, and most especially the Leslie Center for the Humanities. All of these instances at the college immediately recognized the value of events concerning translation, conversations, and student workshops tomorrow morning, the value of such translation events for representing, manifesting, showing the values of the life and work of Monica Otter. So the first person to come speak will be John Copper, Professor Emeritus of Russian and Comparative Literature at the college, who will present a little introduction to and memorial for Monica. John?
Where should I sit?
You should stand where I'm standing. You can sit if you prefer. But no.
So just bear with me for 6 or 7 minutes. And I'm really, I feel honored and flattered that Andrea asked me to do this. And I guess that's all I can say. And welcome again to our panelists for being here today. My job is to talk about Monica and make the link between Monica and the course she created, and then take the inspiration that came out of that course into the world of her students, and to having a panel like our distinguished panelists here today to talk about translation. And then I'll hand things back to Andrea. Monica Otter died in May of 2023, less than a year ago. She was upstairs with us here for 30 years, working in her office in Sanborn, her launching pad for trips across the Green to see colleagues in the foreign language departments on Dartmouth Row, to participate in meetings of her other home, the Comparative Literature Program, to visit various large lecture halls around campus to teach Humanities 1 and 2, to forays through the Upper Valley and to Boston with her choral groups, and I remember fondly, to a basement classroom in the Hop, where she got my students to sing Gregorian chant. Monica was a bundle of contradictions, very private, but unfailingly generous and direct with everyone. Stubborn in the face of bad ideas, but thoughtful and yielding when it came to people. She was always ready to be teased about how, if you were a medievalist, it seemed you had to go regularly to conferences in Kalamazoo. Is that true, Dave?
That's true.
I never saw Monica teach undergraduates, but was privileged to see her with our graduate students. Patience, concern, intensity, clarity. She had an instinct for conveying that she was on the students' side and making their work the best it could possibly be. 25 years ago this winter, Monica single-handedly created Dartmouth's first course on translation, Comparative Literature 19, Translation, Theory and Practice. In 2012, it was cross-listed for the first time with Classical Studies. And in 2019, the 20th anniversary of Monica's course, and in a testament to its campus popularity, Comparative Literature introduced a minor in translation. For the first 15 years of Complit 19, Monica was spelled only by our dear colleague, Margaret Williamson, with us today. But in the last 10 years or so, at least 4 others have rotated through the course. And I see some of you here today in the Club of Honor. Jim, you taught it, didn't you? Jim Dorsey, Nancy Canepa is here. Where's Nancy? Okay, Nancy. And Andrea, did you teach it?
I haven't taught it, I have to admit.
You have not taught it, okay.
But Michael's teaching it now, Michael Wyatt.
Michael, okay, great. Thank you all. For me, the most heartening sign is that I no longer know all of you. You're all younger and keep the course fresh. The humanities faculty, meanwhile, has embraced the centrality of translation to cultural studies, and the college's cross listings reflect this. Just as a side note, I realized that a course that Russian Studies is offering called Ukraine and Western European National Contexts is now being offered as a sub-rubric under Monica's course in comparative literature. I hope this conference and workshop is the first of many, and that the college will support the teaching of translation and translations. A few words on Monica's class. It memorably culminated in student projects. Margaret has given me some examples. Translating into English poetry composed in American Sign Language. Demonstrating how a prestige language like English is used to tell a joke in Korean. Translating a scientific manual from Chinese. Dubbing a bodice ripper serial running on Latin American TV. Rendering in English an Italian opera libretto. A graduate student of mine, an ethnic Kazakh, bilingual in Kazakh and Russian, for her final project, translated Russophone stories written by an ethnic Armenian about the effect of wars in the Caucasus on women's lives. Just try to count the languages and nationalities involved there. We could say that Monica came to translation naturally. She could rival Pangloss in her repertory of languages, to say nothing of her oceanic side interests. But I think something quite definite drove Monica. She loathed the presentism induced in young minds by today's media. Her task as a teacher was to make the Middle Ages present. Present, yet alien and intriguing. And that is what translators do. Render an artist's vision accessible, but judiciously leave intact the strangeness that makes it great. As a medievalist, Monica knew all about what we might call temporal curvature. And from 2016 to 19, she taught a second course, Translation Over Time. To take an example from my own field, how much of Tolstoy's Russian style was strange to his contemporary readers? How much of it sounded clumsily written, as it does to Russians today? What did Tolstoy take for granted in his readership? Should a 2024 translation of War and Peace convey, through stylistic and lexical estrangement, its place of origins outside English and outside our century, when it must still be read, paradoxically enough, as if it wasn't translated at all? This is the hermeneutic nightmare. Where exactly do we position the reader, since inevitably it must be in a brand new place? Translation is undervalued. It doesn't count much for promotion or recognition. Translation is awfully hard. Kafka thought that writing itself was a translation. His attempt at rendering a pre-writing experience that would always fail, and at worst, like an autoimmune disease, leave him starved like his hunger artist. Translation can kill. The Japanese comparatist Hitoshi Igarashi was murdered at the age of 44 by religious extremists because he translated Salman Rushdie. But translation can also enrapture. Look at the joy that lay behind those translation projects from Complet 19. Think of Keats, delighted not by Homer, but by George Chapman's translation. Better still, think of every work you've ever read that you could not read in the original, and ask yourself what your life would be without those books. So thank you.
Okay, so we have two panels for you today, and between the two panels there'll be a short interlude and a reading of a translation by a student from a translation course last autumn with Nirvana Tanuki. But more about that a little later. I'm here just to introduce our first panelists now, for our panel on translation. Translation, its challenges and its rewards, and the exchanges that it seeks and represents. So here today to animate the conversation on translation are three literary translators, Daisy Rockwell, all the way to my right, who works with both Hindi and Urdu literature, and was awarded the 2022 International Booker Prize for her translation of Gitanjali Shri's Tomb of Sand. Alta Price here in the middle, who translates from both Italian and German, and is the recipient of the Gute Kunst German Young Translators of German Literature Award, as well as a finalist for the 2022 PEN America Translation Prize. And just here, Jonathan Smolin, a translator from Arabic, and incidentally, a professor at Dartmouth in the Middle Eastern Studies program, and who is currently publishing what I understand is his 5th translated novel, A Nose and Three Eyes by Ihsan Abdel Kudus. Okay. We'll let you begin.
Thank you. Thank you. There are a few more seats up here, like 4 seats if anyone wants to sit down. But no, okay. So I'm going to start out, and I have some things to read out loud, and I'll explain beforehand what inspired me to write them. When you win a major prize, you get interviewed lots and lots and lots. So, and I won the International Booker Prize in 2022, and I was interviewed over and over and over again, and had to keep explaining translation over and over and over and over and over again. And I found myself just sort of constantly making up metaphors. Translators love metaphors, so I was constantly making up metaphors and analogies, and some of these things would end up on YouTube, and I had no idea what I had said. So last winter, I was in Lahore at the Lahore Literature Festival, and just part of a bilingual translation reading of poetry, and a very earnest young man raised his hand when it was done, and he said, "I saw you in an interview on YouTube talk about a Lego metaphor for translation. Could you elaborate on that?" And I thought I had no idea what I had said. So I started just riffing. I just made up something, and tried not to laugh while I was talking. So anyway, then I went home, and after I had toured a lot, I went home, and people kept saying, "You must write a book on translation," and I didn't really know what that would be. What would that mean? What would it look like? So I just sat down and tried to start writing things down, and what came out were a lot of kind of poems on metaphors for translation. So that's what I'm going to read to you. And the first one is the Lego metaphor, part 1, because there are probably infinite ways that you can do this. I once saw a Lego metaphor for translation on some online forum somewhere. I liked it, but it was slightly off, and then I forgot it. So I had to make up a new one. I've thought of a few versions. I'm still trying to get it right. Here is one version. Imagine, if you will, that you have purchased the Hogwarts Castle Lego set. You have given up the dining room table for this project. You get about 3/4 of the way through, then a dog or a cat or maybe just a lurching adult bumps into it. Broken. This is not completely hypothetical, by the way. You weep, you've lost the instructions, many pieces are stuck in the floorboards. Some are under the carpet, so you rebuild sans instructions. You don't have enough pieces, so you repurpose the space station gathering dust in the corner, the Lego Friends camper set and soda shop. You use all these things and the picture on the box to create a new and somewhat peculiar Hogwarts castle. It's made of the wrong materials and put together in a different way. But it's oddly beguiling. This is translation. Lego metaphor, part 2. You have a child. The child is young, and the child likes Lego. You give the child a Lego airport set on a gift-giving occasion. Thanks, Dad, says the child. Shall we build it together, my child, you ask? Yes, Dad, but let us make a castle instead. My child, these parts and instructions are intended for the sole purpose of building an airport. Though I wish to fulfill your every dream, this one in particular is impossible. But Dad, says the child, I'm sure it can be done. You are an old softy, so you comply. Without instructions, no charts, No use for the numbered bags. Guardrails off, you hurtle forward. In this metaphor, the Lego set represents the original text. The instructions and intended use are the original language. The form of the castle is the target language. The child is the commissioning editor, and the father is the translator. Quilting. Quilting, what are you doing? I ask. Making a quilt, he says. How so? I ask. You don't have any fabric. You don't have needles and thread, or even a sewing machine. Well, he says, I have this beautiful old quilt. Look at the handiwork. And I have all these bits of colored paper. I even have scissors and glue. I will replicate the quilt using these materials. It will be perfect. But, I interject, how is it a quilt anymore if it is made of paper, not fabric? It will not warm anyone at night. It will not be soft to the touch. This project is futile, I conclude. Despite your negativity, he opines, I am not injured, for I shall create an exquisite simulacrum of a quilt. It will be quilt-like. It will look like this quilt. I will hang it on the wall and admire it. This is an imperfect metaphor for translation. A translated book retains its functionality as a readable object. The paper quilt only looks like a quilt but does not have quilt functionality. On the other hand, in this metaphor, the original quilt loses some of its most essential features, but the paper quilt has the potential of becoming a beautiful work of art. Okay, this next one is about my ambivalence about being a translator into English, because we talk a lot about language pairs. So this person does Finnish into French, or this one does Spanish into Italian, but translating into English is a kind of a different beast because of its hegemonic presence in the world. So this is about that. English is a monocrop. English, the great monocrop, its roots on an island, its tentacles all around the world, an invasive species with no natural predator. English is the potato crops for McDonald's French fries, the corn crops for corn oil and corn syrup, the soy crop for all manner of soy byproducts. In America, Iowa is farm country. The small farms are mostly gone now, and the land is covered with endless fields of corn and soy. The corn and soy are sent away and processed and returned to the land in the form of, I can't believe it's not what it appears to be, products. Butter, milk, cream, sugar, all made of soy and corn. The British Empire spread the English monocrop initially, but the American Empire is the greatest expert on the export of the processed and the packaged, the canned and the bottled, the I can't believe it's not real. On the island of the monocrop, we grow up surrounded by nothing but our own language, flat, rippling fields of English as far as the eye can see. Yes, there are small farms scattered about the landscape along the coasts primarily that grow and nourish non-Englishes, but those are other. English crowds in on those crops and stifles them wherever possible. If English was good enough for Jesus Christ, it's good enough for me, for all of us. New metaphor, a padded cell of monolingualism. Mixed metaphor, a cell padded by French fries sealed shut by non-dairy corn soy-based butter substitutes. There are voices outside the cell, beyond the field, but we can't hear them. They don't matter to us. Other languages are decorations for our speech, a word here, a phrase there. They are the sriracha on our French fries, the matcha powder in our soy milk. Is that what it means to translate into English? Are we mixing matcha lattes? One more. Translation is a monster. Dr. Frankenstein wanted to create a human. Instead of going about it the usual way, he wanted to create a human out of parts of other humans. Dr. Frankenstein in this metaphor is the translator. He is like an icky version of the quilt maker. But in this case, the original text is simply generic. He wanted to make a human, i.e. to create life through his own ingenuity and resources without recourse to a womb. So the original is a human, and the man he creates is made of other man parts and stitched and stapled together, reanimated. But a reanimated patchwork is not a reanimated corpse. And when his experiment, i.e. his translation, stands up and walks, that's the special moment when a translator realizes this thing's got legs. It will stand on its own in its new incarnation. And the screams the monster is greeted with as it lurches through the streets, those are the screams of people who find translation fishy, inaccurate, and unnatural. Even though this metaphor is imperfect, since the monster is modeled on the idea of a human and not a specific human, nonetheless, the moment of wonderment and horror at one's monster's animation, that is something most translators have experienced. Thank you.
Daisy, thank you. There's no way I can follow that.
We can just stop. No.
No, so I actually, obviously everyone here found that so enjoyable, but what I wanted to focus on is this one line that sort of jumped up as we were talking about, being invited to Dartmouth, anywhere, being invited anywhere to talk about translation is a huge honor, right? If people are aware that translation is a thing, it's pretty amazing. But then there's the next question of, right, how do we talk about it? There's the theory, there's the practice, and it has often been said, I have often said to myself, as I sit down to a day of translation, and I sit down and I say, what I'm about to do and have to do on deadline is impossible. Like, this cannot be done. I know these languages, and I know this vision of this writer, and I know the worlds that that this particular story or book has come from, and there is just no way I can recreate it in an atmosphere in which it wasn't created to exist. So I love the monster metaphor, I love all of those. And the line that really jumped out to me was from the Lego Metaphor Part 2, where the dad says to the child, though I wish to fulfill your every dream, this one in particular is impossible. And I was riffing on this, and basically what I do when I'm translating oftentimes is I go down endless rabbit holes. I don't know how many other translators do this. I imagine we all do. You've got a word or a concept or a cultural reference either from a different time period or from yesterday, and you need to make sure that you're getting where it's coming from and where it could potentially go. And it involves a lot of research. Oftentimes I think there's this idea that, translation is, you find this word and you replace it with this other word. And I think everyone here is aware that that is not really what translation is. But the rabbit holes, the research that I go down. So I locked onto this word impossible, and it immediately brought to mind the vision of Audrey Hepburn. There's this quote attributed to Audrey Hepburn. Although all the attributions just say Audrey Hepburn, they don't give a film, they don't give an interview, and I'm like, without a source, I don't actually believe that she ever said this. But the internet, everywhere, Brainy quote, all these other, she said this apparently, is that she loves the very word impossible. It doesn't exist because the word itself says, I'm possible. And this stuck in my head because it's sort of a word play that I appreciate. Also because I've worked with editors, publishers, copy editors. I tend to use a lot of contractions when appropriate or when I feel it's appropriate. And I've worked with copy editors who say, well, house style, we don't really do contractions. And I was like, what do you mean what you don't do contractions? Because this book that you have acquired absolutely to capture the voice requires contractions. So there's this give and take. So I don't have anything nearly as well developed and poetic and witty as your metaphors, but I was also thinking about the notional title of this gathering, which is this idea of bridging, right? Which I think is like the number one go-to, and it's so number one go-to that I didn't really want to think about it. Sorry, Andrea, and everyone at Dartmouth. I just thought, I'm not sure that I really want to look into this, but I also couldn't help myself. So I thought, okay, and it happened to be the recent collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. And I in no way want to make light of this because that is, it's so indicative of so many problems in the world today, and people lost their lives. So, but as was already mentioned, Translation, as much as we don't like to make light of it, it really has resulted in people being killed or brought to justice. What is that phrase, brought to justice? Another way of saying people have died for something, or for a belief, or for a practice. So I thought a little bit more about this bridge metaphor, and I thought about how many people it takes to make a bridge, what bridges are for, where they go. In Italy, there's the famous bridge to nowhere. Berlusconi wanted to build a bridge connecting Sicily, and for various reasons, but people are still, this is a cultural touchstone, the bridge to nowhere that was never built. So these ideas of bridges, and I thought about the teamwork that it takes. We have the public who needs or wants the bridge, the engineers and designers who plan it, the fabricators who make the parts that are put together, the builders and contractors who assemble the bridges, the inspectors who make sure it's sound, once it's built, the politicians who do the ribbon cutting. And that was, I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to, if I'm gonna go through with this metaphor of how it applies to translation. So after the politicians do the ribbon cutting and have the photo ops in the media, then the public is traveling across the bridge. And then there are the maintenance and repair crews who keep it functional. And there are countless more that are not seen, right? But these are the ones off the top of my head I thought, okay, it requires all of this expertise and labor. And so to connect those lines, sort of the public who needs or wants the bridge are, I'm not sure, I'm still thinking this through, the readers, the publishers, who have this role. The engineers and designers are the translators. Anyway, I won't go through the entire list, but basically translators fulfill multiple of these roles in this notion of bridging these divides. Some publishing traditions still have a figure who reads every line of the original and then reads the translation and works with the translator. This again exists in some cultures, not so much. I think the next panel, the publishers might want to be able to talk about that a little bit more. It's an incredible amount of labor. The politicians who are doing the ribbon cutting, who are not, they're not involved in the need. They're really there to have the party, right, and take credit for it. And publicists and marketers are essential. And these are things that we don't really think about as we're in the work of translation, but play a real role. And then in terms of the maintenance and repair crews, the translators, reviewers, and critics, how many of you are reading criticism of literature and translation? I want to think everyone here reads literature and translation, but how many people are equipped to cogently write a critique of it and place it within and sing the praises or adequately criticize or analyze, say, the new translation of Don Quixote or the Iliad and all of these. So that it's an entire ecosystem, book clubs, and really, but I wanted to end with this sort of before passing on to Jonathan. The maintenance and repair crews are also the future translators. Frequently, I speak with colleagues who either will only translate living authors, and then there are translators who will only retranslate classics, and it's nominally the same practice, but very, very different motives, different ways of going about it. And I'd like to think of the future translators as the bridge is already there, but if it's no longer speaking the language of the readers who want to access that other side or have that experience. So, yeah, I want to leave time for more of a conversation. So, pass it to Jonathan.
Well, well, thank you all for coming. It's just an absolute delight. Thank you to the sponsors, and thank you, Daisy and Alta. Daisy, your metaphors really got me thinking about the way I've definitely felt like Dr. Frankenstein, and that, I do have a fundamental belief that the translation is not the original, and therefore I'm somehow putting together this thing that does get up and walk off in a way that is terrifying, and I feel a sense of moral responsibility, perhaps. But so I think that is very much going to stick with me. And Alta, I appreciate the kind of metaphor of the bridge, but also contractions, and how I have a translation of a classic novel coming out in June, and I, off the record, spent a lot of time convincing the publisher about why there should not be a single semicolon in this 600-page translation. That this author of melodrama, who was the most popular and prolific writer of Arabic in the 20th century, would never, ever have even thought of using a semicolon in his, if he had written in English. And I spent an enormous amount of time perhaps feeling your frustration about contractions. Contractions, of course, were being used, but there will be no semicolons. And if I find that printed book that they snuck one in, because just because you've submitted it and gone through page proofs doesn't mean that someone hasn't snuck something in the translation by the time it comes out. I'll be very disappointed. But I just want to say that for me, this is really a tremendous pleasure to be here. For me, translation is a necessity, and it always has been. My work on Arabic and Middle Eastern popular culture is self-consciously, I work on what is considered low culture, or kind of lowest, popular culture in ways that are not considered of high cultural literary value. And there's not much translated from Arabic, period. And I cannot take for granted that anybody can read Arabic, for any extensive amount beyond pages. So in order to be able to bring my work to the world, in order for it to be read outside of people who are already fluent in Arabic, I have to translate. This is just a daily reality for me. And it has been from the beginning of my research and the beginning of my work. And so in a sense, while I may feel a sense of pleasure on my own, some of you may know that I have a deep, dark past as a classical philologist, that I studied Greek and Latin in college, and the way of thinking about text from a philological perspective always stuck with me, even while I work on popular magazines and all kinds of things that are considered sensational and melodramatic. But that the pleasure of translation, of thinking about it as something that is an enjoyable process, of something that is something to savor, of a pleasure that is not just something that is a necessity in order for my work to be read, to be understood, to be connected, to have an audience. And I think to see you all here, to see this big crowd, shows the pleasure of translation as something shared, a broader and kind of another way of thinking about this beyond just, at least from my perspective, something that is a necessity, not something that I necessarily take time for savoring. The savoring of the process, but just in terms of in and of itself, a skill, a process of savoring and enjoying and taking pleasure in. So I think I'll stop there and leave it for open up for discussion. So thank you all.
So what's wrong with semicolons, Jonathan?
Yes.
What's wrong?
So in this particular author's case, he was someone that really worked to simplify Arabic in a way. He was the editor-in-chief of the most popular magazine in the Arab world in the 20th century. And for him, he wrote his fiction with each installment. It was all serialized. And he wrote the chapters of his novels the night before the magazine went to the press, okay? So he had 4 hours to write this chapter. He had an outline in his mind, but everything was written. And so this turned out, for the book that I just finished on him, to be a gold mine, because he also wrote the political editorial in that issue and the cultural editorial. And when you line up the installment of the fiction with the political editorial, all of a sudden the fiction becomes something completely different. And you realize how he was writing the political editorial and the translation at the same time, and these intersections between them. So it was a kind of research gold mine for me. But he thought of fiction as a way of kind of democratizing Arabic, of using fiction to bring in a broad public into political debates that wouldn't come in otherwise. So each issue and each installment ended with a footnote, a cliffhanger. It was meant to bring in the broadest possible audience, not for circulation or not only for circulations, but in the hope that that audience would also read the political editorial. So he wrote at like what would be a 7th or 8th grade, kind of level with sensational cinematic language in really short sentences and really crisp language in ways that would be, understandable to someone with an 8th grade education. And so I don't know about you, but at least my 6th grader is not using, my 6th grader is nowhere near using a semicolon, and I don't think many 8th graders are using them either. So that level of crisp cinematic language, I think, is reflected in not just in the word choice, in the sentence structure and the flow, but in the punctuation, as Alta reminds us, and how important that is.
And I'll also say at the American Literary Translators Association conference, I think every single year, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, there's always a panel on punctuation. And you think, do we need the same? Different people present, but it is always an issue. It always will be an issue. Yeah. The typographic traditions of different languages are huge.
It's true. We had a question over there.
I want to ask all three of you, if the languages you translate from are your native languages, and if not, how long did it take you to feel comfortable translating from the language into English? Was there maybe some sort of external validation? Was it a number of years? How do you know that your translation is good?
Well, that's obviously not my native language. Hindi and Urdu are not my native language. I probably didn't start to even really seriously translate until I'd studied it for maybe 10 years or something like that. I don't think I was convinced that it was good either. I just, if you talk to a lot of translators, their underlying reason for translating is a kind of compulsion. Although my husband is a psychiatrist, he says it's not a compulsion because compulsions are things that make you, tormented and upset, like scrubbing the kitchen counter until your hands bleed or something like that. But I said that in front of Anton Her, the Korean translator, and he said that's exactly the kind of compulsion translation is. So I think you don't necessarily start to do it because you think you're good at it or that you're going to be the best. You do it because you need to, because you want to, you feel called to do it. And then, eventually you start showing things to people. Everybody has a different path. So I never worked, as Alta has done, in non-literary translation, but I would show things to people and share them and get feedback. And for me, it was a long evolutionary process where I developed as a translator. Do you want to talk about that?
I grew up, I really loved the monocrop. I grew up in a monolingual family with no access to my high school offered foreign languages, but I was a very bookish child, and I grew up in a small village, fairly rural, isolated, and I knew there was a world out there, and my only access was through books. And actually, I remember it was a New Directions book, a New Directions bilingual at the used book sale on my town green, and I remember opening the book and seeing just this same poem by Hans Magnus Enzensberger. I should remember who translated it, and I can't. I need to look that up. But that speaks volumes too. And just realizing, whoa, this is, and I had always been sort of curious. A lot of my ancestry is German, but no ties, no connection. It's so old. So I had this hunger, and so I studied German for much longer than I studied Italian, but through a happy accident, I was sent on a scholarship to Italy instead of Germany. And then I never planned to go into translation. I never necessarily prepared to go into translation. I found myself translating through, I knew some interpreters, some other translators. So my practice in translation is solely because of amazing individuals who helped me. And part of it was helping me correcting when I was making mistakes in speaking these other languages, or helping me understand the differences between, a written, say, conversational Italian is very different than written literary Italian, even today, especially historically, but still today. And that was solely through instrumental, people that I met. So I firmly, it's really thanks to a bunch of people sort of, I think of it as hand-holding, but I think people encouraging me. There was a group of translators who workshopped, and we would read our things. We wouldn't share the text in advance. We would just show up and read and listen and talk about it. So how long did it take me to feel comfortable? It depends on the day. Some days I feel like I'm in the zone. Other days I feel, have I never done this before? Yes. And it depends also on the author's voice. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a tidy answer for that one.
I'm not a native speaker of Arabic, but I started studying Arabic 30 years ago and lived in the Middle East for many years. So, language, I feel very fluent. But that said, for me, and this is maybe a roundabout way of answering your question, for me, the challenging stage is always working with the English product, not the Arabic product. Mm-hmm. That is, getting that first draft of of Arabic to English is fast. It's thinking about the questions of register, thinking about the questions of flow, thinking about the questions of how would this have been written in English by this novelist. And knowing those nuances from the Arabic is crucial. And that's the part that I think requires the fluency more than being able to transfer, in some ways, an initial draft of Arabic to English. Thinking hard about word choice, flow, punctuation, all kinds of things like this. And that's the really time-consuming part for me. It's the English, not the Arabic, actually. With, through the lens of the Arabic.
Yeah, when you were talking about the Lego metaphor, I couldn't help but think of my friend who would probably call himself a Lego genius. And when he buys these boxes and he follows the instructions, he has a wall of Legos next to him, and when he comes across a step where he says, oh, I think actually there's a much more pleasant way of doing this, or I think I could make this Hogwarts castle much better if I put this piece in that I own that is not part of the set. So I guess in the sense of do you think that translators have a responsibility to stick to the original text, or if you come across an area where you think, well, this could be improved upon, and I know that I can make this better, what do you do, or what do you think people should do?
Well, it's sort of like, it's sort of like what Jonathan was getting at. We are also editors, right? And something I like to call it euphemistically differing editorial traditions exist across cultures. And so, for example, in Hindi, there's hardly any proofreading at all. And especially if someone's famous, then not a word is touched. And so we are left in this uncomfortable position sometimes where we know that if anybody had edited it, they would have, there might be continuity errors or mixed metaphors or things like that. And those we can't bring those across if we want people to think this is a good writer, which they are a good writer. So one of my prime directives is there's no sense in making your author look bad, right? Because we both go down if they do. Because if I want people to think this author is good, then I have to make it look good. And if I reproduce errors or something like that, then I'm blamed for it. The translator is always blamed. If people will say, well, I think there was something lost in translation here because I didn't like this book, so it's your fault if I didn't like the book. So I think a lot of us do these things, but I will ask you to weigh in.
I have so many years of feelings about this, but they're not. This is also a danger of the profession of translation. I think unless I have it in front of me, it's not top of mind. So I'm thinking about a book that I translated last year that will be coming out this summer, nonfiction. It has nothing to do with the individual's prose inside the book. It has to do with the 7 different iterations of the title page that the publisher sent me. And there was all this fighting over who had what role. And it hinged on a mistranslation. because one of the foundations involved didn't understand the difference between editor and publisher, which other languages, you know, as you mentioned, traditions. Anyway, to publish something, to editore, herausgeber, these are all, you know, somebody opened a dictionary, saw, okay, you know, a herausgeber can be editor, so it's edited by this institution. We don't really have institutions, like, anyway, I digress. But it was really harder than anything else in that entire book of historic, beautiful, fascinating letters was this title page. And I had to absolutely give up. I tried in multiple ways to sort of help and say, oh, well, this is really, you know, this, let's think about who did what and give them the right title on the title page. But I was in the minority. And that was a case where I could get very upset and say, this is gonna look horrible. And, you know, and I started consulting other people, and they said, yeah, if you pick up a book and on the title page you see in English that it looks as though the title page misrepresents, you know, you open it and say in English, we would never say that. That's going to discredit the rest of the entire book, right? Which my name was on. So, and it, you know, ego is involved, but sometimes you just have to, you want to fix something or make someone look good or accurately portray it. And there are parties, I guess this is a whole other, I've completely gone off the rails here because it's outside of the text, but it's part of the publishing sort of atmosphere that, you know, people want to do what they want to do, and as a translator, I couldn't, you know, I had to let them do it. So we'll see what happens.
To turn this question back on you, one of the things to think about is the translation the original, right? Is the translation the equivalent of a final exam in your language class to show that you can translate this, right?
Yes.
Or is it something different? In other words, do we need to translate it so literally that everything is there? Well, Arabic loves repetition in words. So there's always triple emphasis on something. Mm-hmm. The same thing can be repeated in sentence after sentence after sentence. That doesn't read well in English. And even though that reads well in Arabic, it's, you know, publishers don't want to keep showing this repetition again and again and again. So how do you, in a sense, respect the original, have the experience of reading the original, but a literal, you know, translation is going to make the author, as Daisy says, look terrible, make me look like a terrible translator, and it's not going to even be the same experience because English has completely different cultural conceptions of how you know, of what of stress, of emphasis means, and how we achieve that in our literary language. So these are the, you know, one of the challenges of what is the translation and how do we render this text so that it is bridged, but not so literally that it actually isn't a bridge.
It falls. Yes.
Falls.
Mm. So your friend is right to edit his Legos. Questions? Yes.
I had a double sort of piggyback on her question, but I loved actually about fixing this. And I started fantasizing about what happens to a translator who actually wants to write a book or a novel, whatever, that is better than the original. So you could walk away and go like, yeah, I was more creative. I was, you know, and thinking about that differently, what happens to your Frankenstein that walks away that then wins a super prize? Then does it make you happier with your translation, more satisfied? Because all three of you mentioned how futile it is in a way to be a translator. Mm-hmm. So you're always dealing with frustration, I suppose, and maybe feeling inadequate in some way. I have no idea. I'm not sort of a comment, not a question. But.
I just want to jump in, and you're making me think of that book has been written. It's called The Revenge of the Translator. And I can't remember the author's name. It's a French author, but it was translated by Emma Ramadan.
Oh, right.
And I highly
like
recommend it. It's really fun.
Yeah.
It was published by Deep Vellum, I believe. Yeah, because you see the translator who has translated this novel starts intervening, and is very vengeful. It's a fun book. I highly recommend it.
Well, on the other hand, I think about this question that people ask me all the time, which is, well, when do you do your own writing? And so then I say, well, what if this is my own writing? You know that, and so the metaphor I like for this is from Robert Frost, because he was asked, why don't you write free verse? And he said it's like playing tennis with the net down. And so I felt like translation is tennis with the net up, like as a creative writer. There's just like tons of constraints. It's like reading sonnets or something. It's a very rigorous kind of practice that, whereas when I do my own writing without any net, I feel like anything could happen. It's just like craziness, you know, like where do I go? I feel like there's too much freedom almost.
I just want to throw in one thing, also something that you mentioned in the back, is, you know, the latest novelist that I've been translating, I had one novel come out 2 years ago, another one in June. He passed away in 1990. But his son, who is devoted to, you know, kind of continuing his memory, told me when he read the first translation, or read, you know, at least the beginning of it, that he could hear his father, that the voice was there, that the cadence was there, the language was there. And for me, that's really what is the real challenge of translation, is the bridge of voice, of tone, of cadence, of rhythm, of almost hearing the voice of the author. And to hear that from the son was you know, frankly, better than all, you know, any reviews that came out. I really was, it meant a lot to me.
If we have one more question, we can maybe go to that, but then we should close and go on.
I see 3 hands. Okay.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. So I have a question actually about what I called the translator's dilemma. So this is based on my observation. So for me, you guys are all accomplished translators, right? So you are more like warriors on the front line. You are out there doing your work, but you all acknowledge that translators, they're less valued and their work should be acknowledged more. Another thing I've observed, that behind the scene, like just as your soldiers out there fighting on the front line, there's also other people who are doing the hard labor behind the scene. And those are the translation scholars, people who are working on translation theory or teaching translation in college and universities, and their work are even less valued or even more neglected. So this is where the translator's dilemma comes about. So what I observed is to establish translation or to elevate translation's academic status as a discipline. I think we definitely need more work from both sides, especially the scholars who are working on translation, writing about translation itself as a discipline. And my question is, what's your opinion about this phenomenon I observed? And also, are you willing to write something based on translation or translation theory to transfer your experience in the actual work of translating some literature or what kind of work it is into something more academic to help to establish translation as a discipline?
I'd be delighted to, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, wow, I've never, you know, and the reason is that I don't have that luxury. In order to be able to write a book about the relationship between melodrama and politics in the Arab world in the 60s, I have to translate novels. That's just how it is. And so I would love to have the opportunity to stop, reflect about translation, to write about it, to teach a class on practice. But I don't have that luxury. If I did, I'd be thrilled to do it. Sounds great, but it's just not part of my, you know, maybe in a year or two, but it hasn't been up to this point.
Yeah, that's why I said it's a dilemma, because I noticed there's a gap, but actually those two parties, the actual translator and the scholar, they should work together to help to contribute to establish translation.
Delighted to.
As a, yeah.
But I think that in my mind, the greatest translation theory is in the translator's notes and introductions to their own translations, and that is even more neglected than translation theory because it's stuck, like all of our theories are stuck in these individual little books, you know, because it's like we, as we theorize each project that we do, it's an individual theory that comes from the book itself. The book tells us how to approach it. And so if you look in translations that have translator's notes and introductions, you'll get a huge amount of fascinating information about what the way that translators work, and because we do theorize what we do as we do it, and we tend not to feel much connection with translation theory as a discipline because it's too broad, right? It's not like we think as each book demands a separate theory from us, in my opinion. And so, and this, you know, I am writing about translation, but in my own little way.
Yeah,
Sorry, you go ahead.
I was going to put in a plug. The reason I suppose I haven't, I feel like I have the same answer as both of you, but is that others are doing it very well. Like I can highly recommend Karen Emmerich's book, Translation and the Making of the Original. Is that the title?
Yeah, that's a really good one.
Fascinating book, practicing translator and scholar. I think so many more of those books could be written. Perhaps you'll be one of the people to write them.
Yes.
And yes to translator's notes. Yes. I had a German book. I'd written a translator's note. The US publisher wanted the second half of it, which was the sort of cut and dry, whereas the European publisher accepted the full translator's note that I'd written that played with language the way that the novel was playing. So that's a next level, sort of these differing what worlds the thought is allowed to exist in. So you have your work cut out for you.
Yeah.
I just want to really underscore what Daisy said. She's so right. Each book is its own theory. It's its own world. And the dial needs to be turned tremendously for each book in terms of how thinking about all of these different aspects. So
Yeah, instead of just thinking
yeah,
in a generalized way. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank all. We have as a special treat or a special activity a reading by Elle Muller, student at Dartmouth, who knew Monica and who did a translation of a poem in Old English that she will tell you about, and who would like to read at this event, or whom we asked to read at this event, as part of a tribute to Professor Otter.
Hi everyone, my name is Elle Muller and I'm a senior undergraduate here at Dartmouth. I'm going to be reading The Wanderer. It's an Old English poem that I translated, kind of inspired by Professor Otter. But first I wanted to give a little bit of context about the poem. I've been focusing on Old English and Old Icelandic texts and translations since Professor Otter's Old English in the Scandinavian Epic Saga course here, and that was kind of a big introduction to literary translation. We learned how to translate from Old English into modern English, and Old English is especially interesting for me to translate because of these compound expressions called kennings, and an example would be a direct translation of treasure giver or gold friend, both meaning king. And these kennings are really exciting because I feel like they create a fun metaphorical stage that modern translators can kind of play with and find new depth in. And in that course, we started translating this poem, The Wanderer. It's a poem written by an anonymous poet in Old English, and it appears in the Exeter book from the late 10th century. It follows a warrior who has lost his kingdom in war, and he wanders the world alone, yearning for what he's lost. At the time when The Wanderer was published, the warrior would have had a personal relationship to the king. And I kept coming back to the emotions that we were talking about in discussion that felt deadened by the fact that I and most other people can't relate to yearning and grieving for a king. So several months after Professor Otter passed away, I took the translation workshop with Professor Tanuki. and I retranslated The Wanderer because I was kind of newly inspired. I kept coming back to my complicated grief for Professor Otter as I was continuing to translate Old English and work on my thesis. I felt that, in a way, it was the closest I had felt to the wanderer, searching for their way without their king, or, in my case, mentor. So my in for this new translation was this gold friend, or king figure. I was looking for a way to emphasize the teachings and guidance that the king provided for the warrior in the original text of the Wanderer, but that we may not be able to empathize as much with. So, the text of the Wanderer. So said the Wanderer, of remembering hardships, of grievous loss, of the fall of dear family. Often each dawn I had to lament my care alone. No one is alive to whom my soul dare openly share. I know, as a truth, it is right and fair that one must govern his thoughts, think as he will in his firmly bound body. The weary heart cannot withstand fate, nor provide help for the uncertain mind. Therefore, those eager for glory often firmly bind and lock their hearts. So my soul is sorrowful, wretchedly separated from home, with family far, shackles had to bind. Long ago, earth's darkness hid my friend. After I became lonely, I traveled, sorrowful as winter, over freezing waves. I sought halls of treasure givers where I, far or near, could find friendship, or one who knew my story, or one willing to console and entertain with joys. He who experiences how cruel sorrow is as a companion knows. He has few beloved confidants. The path of solitude holds him, frozen, life enclosing. Without golden knowledge nor earth's love, he remembers friends of home and receiving praise, how in his youth his gold friend was accustomed to celebration. That joy all perished. Now he knows he must do without his beloved friend and teacher's teachings for a long time.
Thanks very much, Elle. That was lovely. Very moving. We'll move along now to our second panel. Still on translation, but from the angle of fostering translation, promoting translation, and wondering about how translation comes into the world. I have here to my immediate right Barbara Epler, who is the president of New Directions Publishing in New York. You started there a long time ago, and you've already been for quite a while the president of that firm who published the translation that got Alta Prize thinking about German and its relationship to English long ago. Then in the middle here of the table is Jill Schoolman, who founded Archipelago Press in 2003. Archipelago Press is a not-for-profit press devoted exclusively to international prose and poetry. And then all the way to the right is Alex Zucker, who is a translator from the Czech, but at the same time, someone who is very well versed in and very deeply involved in a quest for translators' rights and the promotion of the possibility, the labor possibility of being a translator. And Alex Zucker is going to be guiding this conversation with Barbara and Jill.
Thank you. I think it's more like a parachute drop than a guide.
Dropped you, go ahead.
And yes, thank you. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I think it's because I'm a Virgo. I think that's I needed a question to start off with. And so this is for all of us, but I'm going to ask it first. This is the parachute drop, which was, and it came out of the conversation we had last night at dinner, Andrea, so thank you for that. which is that there is, well, I guess I want to start with it's a quote from a person named Jeffrey Leppendorf, who used to run an organization called the Community of Literary Magazines and Presses. And he had this thing that he would say everywhere. It was like his mantra, which is that until a book finds its way into readers' hands, it's only been printed, not published. So these two people I'm honored to be on the panel with are both publishers, so their lives are focused on putting books into readers' hands, not just printing them, right? And so the question, which may not seem obvious, but there's all this conversation now around the idea that people are not reading as much. I see a lot of people countering that with, and I believe personally, it's this, that people are reading differently. So I think it's good for us to talk about, from where you sit with the publishing houses that you have in this, what I'm going to call ecosystem, given the authors and the translators and the books that you publish, which you have here with you, which I love, and which you may pick up as examples of this. Why is it, why should people read literature? What is the point? And how, or maybe more importantly, how does that manifest? How is that part of what you do? In your case, it's going to be about publishing. In my case, I don't publish. So that's the parachute drop.
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
If that,
Please,
okay.
please. First of all.
Thank you so much for being here, and thank you, Andrea, and everyone else who planned this beautiful event. I would say for me, I think one of the major reasons of reading literature and reading world literature is empathy. And a novel allows us to feel empathy for different perspectives, for different people, for different worlds, for different ways of thinking and being and living. And poetry does too, and nonfiction does too in a different way, I think. It's different voices. For world literature, for translations, it allows you to experience another culture, to enter another culture without traveling necessarily. But I think for me, it's a complex world that an author creates, rather than it's an inclusive one. Even if you disagree with, this character sees this in a completely different way than I would, it humanizes a perspective, or it humanizes it puts ideas into a human being or into a society, and I think that's so important, rather than a divisiveness, which, we all know that what's happening in terms of divisiveness in our culture, but I think that does something else.
I mean, at one level, I totally agree with you, but I think I'm more of a fop. I can't imagine living without reading. It's such a primary food, so I've never really thought about it much. And my efforts to make it more functional and talk about that sometimes are trying to talk to reviewers, like, you have to review this book. This is a really important book. Yeah, I mean, the whole eat your vegetables thing about translation is
terrible.
it's not gotten me anywhere. But I do think the other thing is showing what a pleasure it is, and just having that in the books. And then the more you do it, the more, I don't know, it seems just like as if we're lucky flowers grow, or whatever. I mean, I don't know, or why do you like art, or why do you go? So, I have a hard time with the functionality aspect. But one thing I'd say is, unlike Jill created a press, and I met her before you did. And I remember we went out for lunch with Peggy, and you were like, what should I do? I was like, don't put on your credit cards. It's so hard to run a press without a backlist. I mean, our backlist, even when I joined New Direction in 1984, James Laughlin was still alive. He was extremely wealthy, and when we got up a tree financially, he'd send us a check, But then separately, things like Tennessee Williams always being read, or Borges, mostly Tennessee Williams. I mean, if you look at because all children have to read Tennessee Williams at some point in their life. And so I had like a whole structure. And so I think is really amazing about Jill is like, this is just your taste. I mean, my taste is very congruent with what New Directions always did, but it's amazing. It's true. It's like, it's really different taking on the mantle. And also, he lived for like 13 years. He was still alive, so he was around.
Yeah, guiding you.
Guiding me.
I do think people are reading. I feel, well, I know book sales are still, people are still buying books. I'm not sure if more or less than ever, but I feel like maybe they, as you say, reading differently. Maybe it takes a month to read something that would have taken a long weekend to read, but with all the distractions. But readers, I think, as you say, I can't imagine not reading, but I think young people are reading. I do think.
A lot.
Yeah.
A lot for us. I mean, it's really changed.
Yeah.
And just on a translation note, like a huge change in the ecosystem, and I think this must be true for you too, is that Barnes & Noble has completely changed. I mean, it's like unbelievable. The woman who was in charge forever was this creature who really, I heard her say in public, I don't believe in translation.
Yeah.
Like it was a fucking ghost or something. I was like, you know, Madame Bovary, you know, like amazing. And now Daunt has empowered all the individual stores to buy, and they're very interested in real translated literature and real books. It's really like a night and day. And I think that's fueled by many people, all ages, but a lot of younger people.
Yeah, yeah.
I love seeing people on the subway with our books.
I know. That rarely happens for us. Yeah, no, that empowers the people that work at Barnes & Noble to buy interesting books and just to gauge who lives in this community. So it's great, yeah. But independent bookstores are our bread and butter.
And they've come back.
Yes, and there's new bookstores popping up all over the country, which is exciting.
So let's put a pin in that, and I'll answer from my point of
Yes.
view, because I don't often think about it, but I translated a book. I brought it with me. This book won a big prize called the EBRD Literature Prize last year. It's called The Lake. It's by a Czech author named Bianca Belová. And I was asked to say something about it. I don't normally get asked those types of questions. And this is, it's interesting. I'm going to tell a story because I think it goes to what you're both talking about and my question. Because it's often described as a dystopian novel. It's about a young or a boy in an unnamed Central Asian country on a big lake, which is actually the Aral Sea, that dries up due to over-industrialization. This is in fact what happened to the Aral Sea under when the countries surrounding it, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, were part of the Soviet Union. This boy grows up in a family where his father is a fisherman, dies not at sea but on the lake. His mother runs away. He doesn't know why. Everybody in the village has deformities and really bad eczema because of all the pollution in the lake. And the Russian soldiers are raping girls and women in the town, and he runs away to the city, and all I'm going to say is more bad shit happens. And people are describing it as a dystopia, but what Belová, Bianca, the author, has said, and I 100% agree with her, is that every single thing that she describes in this book has happened, and does happen and will continue to happen. So there's actually nothing dystopic about it at all. It's actually all reality. So that made me think, and I recognized that right away. But the thing is that I think what a novel can do is allow me, and I'm saying me because as a translator, at first, in the first instance, I'm a reader, right? And we've talked about this on the previous panel. We're a close reader. Can make me feel things about a situation that I wouldn't feel if I were just reading a news article about them, which is sort of like empathy, but not quite. It's a little bit different thing. Make me willing to feel them because there's more of a story attached to it, which isn't just like this is happening and nobody's wagging their finger at me, or in either direction, like either you should be either you should be reading your vegetables, or this is junk food and you shouldn't be reading it. Either way, right? Because there's also that. But I can get, but because it is art, or it's a creative, it's a creation, creative. I don't want to use the word production, but it's a story. I can get caught up in it, and in a way that I'm not going to get. But not in a addictive way, like doom scrolling, right? Reading a novel is not like doom scrolling. I think you can, like, if you put people in a CAT machine, do CAT scans, while they're reading. That's not what happens when you're reading a novel. Is not the same thing as when you're scrolling through Twitter, or TikTok, or whatever. And so and then it can surprise you in a way that a news story is never going to surprise you, because you'll be caught up in this story and maybe you'll be having feelings, and then the author uses some formulation, some words together, or an image that, you weren't expecting it. And to me, like, that's, and that's the joy, right, that you're talking about. So there's the, whatever, the empathy, and there's the feelings, and the knowledge, but there's also like the sheer joy or serendipity, or whatever you want to call it. And so to me, that's a thing that you can get from reading literature that I don't think you can get anywhere else, from any other type of art, or from anything else.
Sort of a deep communication with the reader and the writer.
Yeah.
You get into their mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, this is going away from publishing and more back into translation, but, because, and I sometimes feel like what literary translators do should actually be called interpreting, not translating, because to me, an interpreter who's trying to convey more straightforwardly what somebody's saying as they're saying it, that's more like what I think of as translation, but what I'm doing when I'm translating a novel is more interpreting. But when you read a book, when any one of us reads a book, we're also interpreting, right? So actually, but you're just not writing down your interpretation of what you're reading, but you are interpreting it. And if you started writing down what you were thinking of, that would be a translation. It would not necessarily be the best translation of that book, but it would be a translation. Yeah. We'll talk about that at the workshop
What's
tomorrow.
Important to you would be different from what's important to us as you read.
So, but you started to talk about bookstores, and I'm really curious where, in book sales, we can talk about, there's been a lot of really interesting data that we've gotten thanks to, Chad Post, who started this database, which you can now find on the Publishers Weekly website, of all the translations published in the United States each year. And you can look in how many books from different languages in different countries, and gender breakdown, genre, if you would have to look, because it's not classified by genre there. But, how so many, we just had a collapse of this. I don't think either of your presses are distributed by Small Press Distribution, but there was just a collapse of this really important company called SPD, Small Press Distribution, that very small presses rely on for distribution, and just like literally overnight just disappeared.
With the money.
Yeah.
With their money.
So
they can't get their books back?
There's problems because that person somehow owed money.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's
so
really
no, that's okay.
Sad.
But so I'm curious, from where you sit, not just what is the future, but do you think you can continue doing what you're doing the way you're doing it now? If not, what, or like, where are you trying to steer things? Or do you not know? Are you talking about this with each other, with authors? Like, I'm really curious about that right now. And I'm going to leave AI to the side.
Oh yeah, let's not talk about that.
Because that can take over, and I
Yeah,
don't want
absolutely. Do you want to go first?
I want to go first, but later I want to come back and ask
Yeah,
you where you
we got-
find the Czech authors that you want to do.
Lots of
We'll come
plans to
back.
put.
Yeah, okay. We'll come back.
Yeah.
Well, I think our answers might be both yes, but in different ways, because we're really fortunate in New Directions. We've had very great luck in hiring terrific young people and really good young editors and really good like truffle hounds, and they go out into the world and they come back. Like with this book, it's just amazing. A short Danish novel called The Employees. It's like set on a spaceship. It's all employee memos, but. And so that's huge, is to keep a publishing house like New Directions, the only thing that distinguishes it is its employees, and then what we've chosen to do over all these years, and then that informs us too. And so, but if you have like people who don't get it, or really like think a book's going to make a huge amount of money and spend too much on it, that would just scuttle us, and it doesn't make it would throw things off. And so, it's hugely important that the people who will work there understand and kind of drink the Kool-Aid.
Mm-hmm.
So that's most important, and keeping a lot of relationships healthy, like with the authors, with the translators, with your friends domestically, if you're birds of a feather, but also internationally, because a lot of people come by the office and you meet them, and sometimes translators send you something, it's just not right for you. Like we don't really do. We grew up under New Directions, supposed to be this experimental or avant-garde, and all that is very baggy, but it's still true essentially. And so sometimes a translator comes and they're obviously a really good translator, and but the book just isn't right. So if you can figure out a way to say that in a nice way, they might then find a book that would suit us, and or you might be able to say, I think I know somebody at Random House who might be able to do something, find an audience. So
I do that all the time.
yeah, right? Yeah, so they don't get discouraged.
And it is a community that way. There's no competition. I don't feel.
Do you mind?
I mean,
no, not actively. No.
Wait,
But Edwin gets books, and I'm like, yeah.
Before you go, Jill, though, do you mind if I just? I'm going to push a little do you feel like you need to do something different in the next 5-10 years about how you publish? Or you feel like basically what you said is the way that you can keep going, and as long as you have the right people working for you and the right relationships.
And the right books. I think, if there's a total world disaster, people aren't going to be buying books, and I don't know if the world's going to get away with the way we're going. But if the world doesn't melt, the dictators don't all take over, this could go on and on, because you have to I always think of Tancredo and the leopard, when he tells his uncle, to stay the same, we have to change. So you have to change. You got to get used to things. Like you've got to put new language about AI on your copyright page. You've got to write letters to these people. Things that I didn't have to do back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know.
I feel like you're an optimist in this case. As you said, I started the press 20 years ago, and I decided after talking to a lot of people we should set it up as a not-for-profit, because we're starting from scratch. I knew we wanted to do very literary books, and those don't always make money, and I knew I didn't want to try to, as you said, this is going to work because it's just like this book that worked. You can't do that. So set up as a not-for-profit, and we started out doing 6 books a year, moved up, now we're doing 16 books a year, still have a staff of 4, including me. And we are so hand-to-mouth still. It is not getting easier, and we have all sorts of, I agree with everything you said, but the difference with New Directions and us is we barely can make payroll every 2 weeks. We are that close to not surviving. And half of our income comes from book sales, which are great. We have a great distributor who takes too much of a percentage, and who charges us for having too many books in the warehouse when they're not selling our backlist. Yes, some of our backlist sells, but we don't have a Tennessee Williams. We have certain books that, like this one, continues to sell really well, Sarajevo Marlborough.
Does everybody in the room understand when Jill says a backlist?
An older book that wasn't.
Don't be shy if you don't know what a backlist is.
Yeah, I'll just explain it. There's the front list and the back list. The front list is the new books that come out every 2 or 3 seasons, and booksellers tend to. It depends. Good independent booksellers keep a lot of backlist books of literary presses. Some booksellers don't. If it doesn't get good reviews, if it doesn't get buzz, they'll set, and you can return books. Bookstores can return books to the distributor. So after a couple months or after a couple weeks, it's usually a couple months, they'll send them back and the book's dead. But it's, in our case, I think every book we're publishing is a classic in some way, contemporary classic, and there's reasons to keep the book in the bookstores, and things keep happening. It doesn't happen immediately. But saying that, it is really, really hard for us to get grants. It's really hard to find donors. It takes a lot of energy and time, and I feel like right now I need to spend more time than I would like raising money. But it's essential, and I love the books. It's totally a labor of love. The kids' books are doing well. We are doing these pretty wonderful picture books from all over the world, and those have another audience. We're always trying to creatively find new audiences and reach new communities with our books. And each book has its own story and has its own natural readership. But as you said, I'm working with really great people. I'm working with three and a half really great young people. They're all in their late 20s, and I feel very lucky. It's really a collaborative effort. And yes, we feel like this is going to go on and on, but it's scary. Mm-hmm. It's scary. Yeah.
But I had that like 25 years ago after JL died, and I couldn't sleep.
Yeah, I'm not sleeping.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
It's horrible.
So what's your worst fear? Or what, not your worst fear, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze
right.
you.
Let me tell you.
Like, what is, the fear? Is it that you can't get your books into bookstores? Is it that people are not going to buy them? Is it just that you're not going to sell enough books, and one day you're not going to be able to pay people, so they're going to walk?
It's that even though we're getting great reviews, and a lot of independent bookstores love us, and we have a lot going on. We have 300 members that get every book of ours, and it all doesn't add up to being able to hire a fifth person. I mean, it's mm-hmm. really, really, we're all overworked. Not many people lose as much sleep as I do.
Yeah.
And, but it's we have to make decisions. Do we have the funding to bring an author over? If we don't, then we don't do it. Or sometimes we do it anyway, and that's like, oh no, why did we do this? But so it's always like a question of, do we need to do this, and how do we do it to make it work? So yeah, it's just survival, basically.
You're also insisting on quality of writing, and also,
yes.
I'm just saying, like a French flap at least adds $1 to our unit price.
Yep.
Easy.
Yep.
And very good paper. This is not cheap, the binding
true.
quality.
It's true, sewn and glued. Just saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, we try to do quality, but that's even higher. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking about hearing you, Jill, sounds like the situation of a translator. Mm. I'll just bring in here, I think the reason I'm here sitting with the two of you is I've done a lot of work along with other translators with a few different organizations that do advocacy for literary translators, but I think particularly the Authors Guild, which is a professional association. Translators can join, illustrators can join, designers can join, and which has on its staff attorneys who will review contracts for people. And for a couple of years, I was co-chairing the translation committee at PEN America, which had a model contract for literary translation, but because PEN America as an organization actually doesn't deal with that, it's about free expression. I ended up, going to the Authors Guild and asking them, since I found out that they do have, translator members, if they could do a model contract with a commentary for literary translation, and they did. And a group of us worked with them over a period of 6 years to get a model literary translation contract and commentary. Together with that, the other project that mostly I worked on with Jessica Cohen and Julia Sanchez was to start a survey of working conditions for literary translators, which you can find on the Authors Guild website. You can just Google literary translators, Authors Guild, working conditions, you'll find it, which we did the first one in 2017, and the goal was to do one every 5 years. And this was based on a similar survey that was conducted by an organization in in Europe called Seattle, CEATL, the Conseil Européen des Associations de Traducteurs Littéraires. They did a survey of working conditions for translators across Europe for the first time in 2008. And another translator named Catherine Silver first brought that to my attention. So this is modeled actually on that. Asking people, literary translators, how much they're paid, do they get royalties, what kind of royalties, how many hours, do they put in, are they full-time, part-time, what kind of degrees do they have, and then we asked demographic questions, but kind of the main upshot, but the point was that, translators were talking a lot among themselves about pay is not going up, but it was all anecdotal, so we wanted to get data on that. And so now we've done the first iteration of it, so from 2017 to 2022, and discovered that the average pay, and this is a whole subject in and of itself, went up from 12 cents a word to 13 cents a word, which is 8%, but over those same 5 years, the cost of living went up 20% in the United States. So there are also, just in general, very few literary translators in the United States who make a living solely from, let's say, translation and translation-related activity, especially in the U.S. There's a history of literary translators being in academia. Where if you publish, you usually don't even have the copyright, and you're not getting paid to do that at all. So
these days,
still,
really,
it depends on the press. Yale University Press is not like that. They have an imprint devoted to translation, Margellos World Republic of Letters, who are great.
Like that. No, we always give the copyright to the translators.
Yeah, but university presses often do not, just like they don't give it to their authors. I've been surprised at some of the famous people who've written, books for university presses and don't have the copyright. But the other thing, so anecdotally, we hear all the time still about translators who work not for the two of you, but for what we would call the big five publishing houses that are still routinely, offering people, let's say, 10 cents a word, which is, I would say less than half of what a person should be getting, and not any royalties and not any subsidiary rights. And I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but so there is a question of sustainability there. If you want to have, because I do think it's important for there to be professional literary translators, because you have to spend a certain amount of time doing something to get good at it, right? And if you're only doing it occasionally, it's just a hobby, then you're going to have a lot of hobby translations. So that's not like a lead-in to anything. It's just my perspective as a person, when it comes to publishing and translation. But so when I think about the future, I am concerned, not for myself personally, but about what AI might do, but also about the future of publishing in general, because I do think it feels like it's a hard time, or it's been a hard time for a while. And I do think I would love to see more conversations between translators and publishers about how to make the whole thing more sustainable, because our interest as translators in doing this advocacy is not to put small presses out of business.
Right, yeah.
We want it to be more sustainable for everybody, right?
If there were more grant-making entities that could support translation, and it's translators and editors and freelance editors too.
So I'm wondering, are there, and I'm not asking you for answers right here on the spot, but I'm thinking about the same way that, prison industrial complex abolitionists think about, if we're not happy with prisons, policing, and surveillance, and we want a society based on ending harm rather than, using punishment as creating harm as a response to harm. We have to imagine something different, not based on what we have now. Is there some way to imagine publishing i.e. putting books in readers' hands that is different than what we have now.
I feel instinctively, I think universities could be more involved with independent presses. I mean, this is an example. We're here. It's fantastic. And thank you. It's helping us. But also, I feel like, there are a lot of family foundations that love to give money to art galleries and, Carnegie Hall, and it's very sexy to give money to these places. And a lot of those places could be supporting translators and small publishers or independent publishers. And that would be another avenue. And there are, foundations come and go. They're fickle. So it's like for 5 years you'll get support from one foundation, and you could get support from Ministries of Culture for translations.
Yeah, from governments.
Yeah, but it's different for a for-profit and non-for-profit. But I feel like that would be huge if there was more of an awakening to this is really expensive. Printing costs are huge, and if they were subsidized, if the NEA had more money to subsidize, if each state had more money to support their publishers and translators.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm such a stick in the mud. I think sometimes, I don't know, I think if the wheel rolls, it works. I think that it's not fair if you're not profit and you can't get the amount of funding that's necessary. But, because there are other, there's the other models like that information wants to be free. And so I'm often on the end of like, well, gee, yeah, I would like to. And we do give free books to prisoners and, don't charge for like people with seeing, that they can't read it. So there are ways to get our books otherwise that's nice. But I don't believe in all that. I kind of think that,
well, it's not just
it's free,
information.
but it's people's art. And if they don't get paid and we get then killed, it's not going to help anything except for this concept, which is kind of an interesting concept, but like a lot of them should just stay nice conceptual.
But even donations, it would be wonderful if someone would step up and say, we want to donate 100, we have 230 books at this point that are in print, or almost. We want to put your books in libraries, and we want to, do that we want to pay for the shipping cost to donate your books for prisons and for, whatever, educators. I think that we could think creatively, and I think communication about what's needed is key.
Yeah. So this is, among other things, an invitation to everybody in here to imagine what might be different. But I want to just pause because I don't know if you were going to give us a sign when we need to move to Q&A. I haven't been keeping track of the time.
Yeah, it's 5:35, so we should be wrapping up pretty soon.
Okay, so let's see if people have questions. Yeah.
Could I just a few minutes?
I just want to say one thing. If the young translators, I don't know if everybody knows about Penheim, the Penheim thing, which you would know because sitting on the anyway. So the Penheim, you only need 30 pages of a translation, 30 pages of the original, and a note from the copyright holder or the agent or the author, and you could submit it, and it doesn't win you that much money. It's like $2,000 or $3,000, but like 10 or 15 people get chosen, and those books have a hugely higher possibility of being picked up, and truly by the Big Five too.
This
is
is the translation fund.
It's a really good thing.
Administered by PEN America. That's what Barbara Epler is talking about, which has historically given grants to people who are early career and working in languages that haven't been translated that much. Yeah, they're not grants to translate a whole book, but to do a portion of one, which can help you and help you find a publisher. Yeah.
It's a real gold stamp, both for you as a translator, but also people think then they can publish them. That's like that, because it's not really fair that in the big houses, the marketing people are often making the decisions about what people buy. And so the editors can be really frustrated because they know it's a really good book. There's a name no one can pronounce, and they can't really prove it. There's no track record. And so they get shot down. Whereas if you've got the Penheim, it's a little shiny thing. But they want a Penheim. It's a good translation anyway.
Right, that's true.
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, that's good.
Just throw that in there.
So, questions?
Barbara brought all these books, and I'm kind of wondering about them.
I brought them because usually.
Because they've been sitting in
Oh,
sort of
so
messy,
I was.
elaborate.
In sometimes with these things, you can kind of talk about different ones and like your disasters with some of them, or why they're interesting, or why together they kind of tell the story about, or the surprise New York Times bestseller. The first one we had since Paul Bowles, kitty, see, animals.
Cat books.
Yeah, cat books. Anyhow, so no, actually, I thought sometimes conversations go more like that. It's easier for me to talk about the proof and the pudding than, I'm not a big theorizer.
And I would love to.
But these are all, these are for adoption. We both brought them with the idea that people would want to take one home.
Yeah.
I'm not taking these back to New York.
Come take one home. Yeah, no, I'm not either. So you're welcome to grab a book or two of ours too.
Yeah. Could I tell one little story?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I'm a monoglot, and I love Laszlo, and this was like the 5th book I'd worked on by him. And we do it sometimes in-house. We'll have, like, Declan does them with Audley Musla, and I do them with, or I used to, but George and Laszlo had a break. The great George Surtees. This is a great translation. Anyhow, so 20 years later, Laszlo sends me a note. Why did you take 25 pages out of my book? And I was like, 25 pages out of your book? And there had been these like 4 little asterisks, but of course nobody in the office, I'm a monoglot, and so I had no idea, and I don't read Hungarian. And so I wrote George, and I said, is that true? And we hadn't been in touch recently, and I was like, it was boring.
Oh my God.
It was so humiliating.
Oh wow.
So we got them translated by somebody else. Pretty good. Just say. So there's disasters, you know. You're lucky if the author actually likes you.
Yeah. And Edwin had a situation where 25 pages were out, but they didn't mean to. They just didn't get printed. Like somehow the copy
That's what I
editors.
thought you were going to say.
Yeah. So that happens. Oh my God.
And Laszlo does weird things. So 5 little asterisks wasn't. So I was like, whatever. It's asterisks.
How was the translator thinking they were improving it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Your math has been speaking too long.
time. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this discussion. This is all really interesting. I think it's really interesting just thinking about, like, you know, the economic side for, at least for publishing, what you have to think about, what you have to balance, and having to really think about, you know, how to numerically quantify the value of a book. And then at the same time, I guess I'm just curious how you balance that with the fact that I think you have so much power as a publisher in that you get to choose, you know, whose voice you're elevating, and who gets to have their work seen by readers. And so I'm just curious how, I don't know if this is a question or something that you have to balance of, you know, you do have these pragmatic economic concerns, but also maybe just more abstractly what the value of books are in non-economic terms, and like how you balance that.
Oh yeah.
I could tell you just a little story. So when JL died, he protected us for 21 years by literary trust. So we didn't have to pay anyone, but the conditions were we could sink or swim. Like if we failed, all the copyrights would go back to the authors. And if we made it, we'd then, in 21 years, transfer the stocks as per his will to 2 of his children. But meanwhile, one of them died. And so there's these 2 grandchildren who are in their early 20s, and it's not just New Directions. They've inherited a lot when their father died. And so I took their money manager out, and I was like, George, I just met him. I was like, and he works for Infinity Investments in Greenwich, Connecticut. I was like, but it wasn't so bad. I said, he was actually very nice. And I said, you know, half the books we publish, we know won't make any money. We're making a choice because we think the book is really, really good. And with the idea, because that's the way JL did it, that some of that will catch on in time. Like a lot of weird books, even things that are now totally canon, like Borges, they were not immediate successes. Or a lot of the poetry list is now like highly anthologized, blah, blah, blah. Anyhow, so it's not like we really are just running, we're really running on whether or not it suits the list and whether or not we think it's great.
Yeah.
That's more it. I mean, and you want to, you know, that elevate thing is a little, I don't know. I don't think of it that way, but of course it's true. Some voices get heard more than others. Some languages get heard more than others in English.
No, and a lot of our decisions are based on, is this translation strong enough? Does it come alive in English in this translator's voice and eyes and heart? And if not, then we won't do it. But also what the books we choose, there's different reasons we choose each book. And it is, do we feel this is important, urgent, relevant, a beautiful voice, an original, groundbreaking something voice, or something to say that's original or needed? Or is it just brilliant? Is it just funny and incredible? And whatever. We have a small team, and we all more and more are all deciding together. Do we want to do this? And it's interesting. I think our books have shifted a little bit in direction over the years, and maybe that's because it's not just me saying I love this book. It's our group saying we all want to love these books, but for different reasons. But a lot of it is the translation strong enough? And you can edit a translation, but it has to be at a certain level.
What I was saying to the translators, I just want to repeat this. When they say the Frankenstein gets up and walk, most translations don't get up and walk. And so you have to have a little genius to have the Frankenstein, to have a Frankenstein touch.
Absolutely.
So, just saying. Yeah, it's hard to get it to walk.
Yeah. To breathe, to giggle.
Sorry.
Should we take maybe one more question and then
Sure.
wrap up?
Questions are good. Don't be shy.
Do you have a story of a translator that actually helped redefining the trajectory, the editorial trajectory, or in the opposite direction? Did you help redirect a career of a translator towards a certain genre or towards a certain kind of books and so on?
I have a short story. When Anne McLean did our first Cortázar, I called her up out of the blue. I didn't know her, and I asked. I knew she was interested in certain kinds of books, and she almost fainted. And she it changed her career, and she, became such. She did 4 Cortázar books with us, but I think it was important for her that door opened.
And we've been really lucky in our translators, and so when we first started doing Bolaño, who's just a great writer, who we no longer publish because there's a very greedy agent. They've all been taken away. It's hard to be little. But anyhow, his name is Chris Andrews, and he is a poet an academic who lives down in Australia, and he really then got involved in directing helping us decide which people to take on. And he retired as a professor, and now he's on a quarterly retainer because I really trust him. He also does César Ayer, he also does the French, he just did an Agatha Christoph book. He's just someone I know. He gets us, but we get him too. So so there's all sorts of, or there are people that you just know very well, like Margarito Costa, and sometimes it's young people. It's like, from being on the Penheim, I may be out of time, but there was this really wacky Indonesian book called Beauty is a Wound, and it was the first chapter, and the first chapter was insane, but genius, and really well translated. And it was this Dwi Ayu, who's the most beautiful woman in Indonesia, gets up and comes out of her grave. And so, I thought, not only do I think it should get a Penheim, but I think I want to publish it. And it was, actually, Mate was on it. He goes, "Isn't this a little zany for you?" I was like, "I like zany." But anyhow, and this also relates to the monocrop. So what happened with that book was it was a very young translator named Annie Tucker, and she'd gone to Indonesia, and she was there. She was getting her PhD from UCLA in different sorts of child development. She was different cultures dealing with autism. And so, but she was bored just doing that, and it was complicated. But her Indonesian was getting better and better from doing all these interviews with different doctors and physicians and families. And anyhow, she joined a dance troupe, and when she was doing the traditional dancing, she was seeing what people were reading, and she said, "What should I read? I'm going to try to read now." And then she read this book called Beauty is a Wound. It was really big. And so she taught herself Indonesian, and all these things I didn't know. I didn't know Bahasa Indonesian is only 60 years old. It's a really young written language. And because they they synthesized Sumatra and Japanese and different things to make this thing that would supposedly help this huge. I didn't know it was the largest Muslim country. All sorts of things you don't know. But anyhow, and then I read it. She sent it in, and I was like, oh shit. like really bad. Like, oh my God, chapter 4 recurs in chapter 7, and there's a very limited vocabulary, and so everybody's pretty or everybody's ugly, and it's just like, and some of the repetition was like shadow puppet plays and on purpose and folkloric, and it was interesting, but most of it was like just shabby, and I was just like, oh no. And so I wrote Annie, and I was like, help, and you know that, and she goes, I thought you'd notice. and so I said, well, she goes, I'm sorry, I faithfully translated it. And so, yes, those repetitions are throughout, you know, and I was like, yeah, and 13 is again chapter 17. Because the only thing you can do is write Eka. And we'd already launched the idea of publishing this book, and we'd paid for it. And so, and I'd never written Eka directly except for to congratulate him that we were going to publish him, and that we're really happy, blah, blah, blah. And then I was really unhappy when the book came in. And he was so nice. He goes, oh, that would be great if you edited it. I did that as a cooperative. It was never edited, and it was just things I'd published in the school magazine, and they had just, but then it had gotten published that way in Chinese and Malay, but that's all they'd done.
Wow.
And
So you edited it.
so we just edited it, and it went from like this, and he also said, no, I understand that you've got a lot of words in English for beautiful. And so, and I said, so I'm going to change language, and he was like, that would be great. And he was still really young. I mean, I think he was like 28 or something. And but then that went into 25 languages because it was in English. And his life changed, including Dutch, which had occupied Indonesia. Anyhow, so sometimes it can be a good thing.
Yeah, it's
Going to
a
English.
bridge.
A bridge.
Yes.
Segue.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Can we say thank you to everybody?
oh my God.